You can sit across from someone who never insults you, never raises their voice, never does anything you can clearly call wrong, and still end up feeling like you're the problem every single time. And the most confusing part isn't the conflict. It's how you start losing trust in your own memory, your own reactions, even your own sense of reality, while everything on the surface still looks completely normal. You're sitting in front of someone who has never shouted at you, never insulted you directly, and never done anything you could clearly label as wrong. On the surface, nothing dramatic stands out. And yet, after most interactions, you end up being the one who apologizes. Every disagreement leaves you feeling like the problem. Even your good moods don't stay stable for long. They get questioned, drained, or subtly shifted into something uneasy you can't fully explain. When you try to understand it, it feels like confusion, but it isn't really confusion. It's a pattern, a quiet psychological dynamic often linked with what is called covert narcissism. If this feels familiar, it's because the effect is rarely obvious. It doesn't show up through open conflict. It builds slowly through small emotional shifts that accumulate over time. When people hear narcissist, they usually imagine someone loud, arrogant, and attention-seeking, someone who dominates conversations, demands recognition, and openly puts themselves above others. That form exists and is easier to identify. But there is another form that works differently. The covert narcissist doesn't want to be seen that way. In fact, they often know that obvious arrogance pushes people away. So instead, they adopt a quieter strategy. They may present as sensitive, misunderstood, emotionally deep, or as someone shaped by pain or difficult experiences. This makes them harder to recognize because on the surface, they don't appear threatening. Sometimes they even seem thoughtful or emotionally aware. But beneath that presentation, similar psychological patterns can still exist, just expressed more subtly. In personality psychology, narcissism is often discussed in two broad forms: grandiose and vulnerable. The covert version is usually closer to the vulnerable expression. Instead of loud superiority, it may appear as insecurity, emotional sensitivity, or self-doubt. But research still points to underlying traits like entitlement, self-centered interpretation of events, and in some cases, subtle manipulation or emotional exploitation. The outer behavior changes, but the internal structure can remain similar. So the real question is, what is actually happening underneath? In many cases, this pattern doesn't come from a conscious belief of superiority. It's not a clear thought of "I am better than others." Instead, it often works through a hidden emotional logic, where the person feels misunderstood, undervalued, or emotionally deprived, and slowly begins to center the relationship around that internal wound. Because of this, conversations can quietly shift without you noticing. Responsibility starts to feel uneven. Emotional reactions may feel disproportionate, yet difficult to challenge. You may find yourself adjusting your tone, your words, even your emotions, just to keep peace. Over time, this creates a subtle imbalance. You begin second-guessing yourself more. You become more careful, more self-aware, more focused on not upsetting them, while they remain emotionally central in the interaction. And the most disorienting part is that nothing looks obviously wrong. There is no single moment you can point to, only a gradual feeling that the dynamic is being shaped around one person's emotional world, rather than a balanced exchange between two people. This is why it often goes unnoticed for so long. It doesn't rely on open conflict. It relies on quiet emotional positioning, repeated over time, until the relationship starts to feel heavier than it should, without a clear reason why. What they're actually living with is something quieter and more constant, a low simmering belief that they deserve recognition, understanding, and appreciation, and that life, and especially the people in it, are continuously failing to give that to them. It doesn't usually show up as obvious arrogance. It shows up as grievance, as if there is an unspoken injustice running through everything they experience, and somehow other people are always involved in it. Over time, this internal lens becomes the default way they interpret everything. Neutral events don't stay neutral for long. A delay in response becomes disrespect. A different opinion becomes a personal slight. A moment of distraction becomes evidence of not being valued. The mind is always scanning for meaning, but the meaning it finds is often centered around being overlooked, misunderstood, or emotionally deprived. This creates a constant emotional undercurrent where peace is fragile and validation is never fully enough to settle it. That mindset shapes how they communicate. They rarely come out and make direct demands. Instead, they hint, they imply, they withdraw. They don't openly confront your ideas. They simply become colder, more distant, less available after you express them. And when you try to understand what changed, you're not given a clear answer. You're pulled into something else entirely. Suddenly, the focus shifts to something you said weeks ago, your tone, your energy, a moment you barely remember. This shifting of focus is part of what makes the dynamic so disorienting. It removes the possibility of resolving anything in a straightforward way. You think you're entering a conversation about a current issue, but you end up defending your entire character. The original moment disappears under layers of reinterpretation, where intent is questioned more than behavior, and perception becomes more important than facts. This is where a psychological pattern often described as DARVO comes in: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's not always loud or dramatic. In these dynamics, it can be extremely subtle but still disorienting. The result is the same. The original issue disappears, and you find yourself defending your intentions instead of discussing what actually happened. You are no longer responding to what you did, but to what you are allegedly like as a person. And none of this operates randomly. Each behavior serves a function, whether conscious or not. The goal is to maintain control of the emotional environment while still preserving the image of someone who would never try to control anything at all. It creates a paradox where influence is exercised indirectly through mood shifts, withdrawal, implication, and emotional pressure, rather than direct requests or clear boundaries. Take the silent treatment. From the outside, it can look harmless, just someone needing space, someone stepping back to cool off. But inside the relationship, it feels completely different. It lands like punishment without explanation. There's no clarity about what caused it, and no clear path to resolve it. So you start guessing. You replay conversations, you adjust your behavior, you become more careful, more accommodating, more eager to fix something you can't even clearly identify. What makes this especially powerful is the uncertainty. The human mind is not comfortable with ambiguity in connection. When closeness suddenly becomes unpredictable, the nervous system starts treating the relationship as unstable. You begin monitoring tone more closely, reading between lines that may or may not be there, and trying to preempt the next withdrawal. Slowly, your behavior shifts not toward authenticity, but toward prevention, avoiding anything that might trigger distance again. Over time, that response becomes automatic. Your nervous system learns that connection and approval are unstable, something you have to work to restore rather than something that stays consistent. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to build, not from a single conflict, but from the repeated effort of trying to stay safe in the relationship without ever being told what safety actually requires. Then there's martyrdom. This one is even harder to detect because it doesn't come across as aggression. It comes across as sacrifice. They give, they help, they show up. But beneath it all is a quiet emotional ledger being kept. Nothing is openly demanded, but everything is remembered. And when tension rises or distance appears in the relationship, that ledger gets brought forward in phrases like, "after everything I've done," sometimes spoken directly, sometimes just implied through tone or timing. What makes this especially complex is that the giving is not necessarily fake. The help, the effort, the support may all be real, but it becomes emotionally weighted over time, as if every act of care carries an invisible expectation of return. This creates a situation where gratitude is never fully sufficient. Appreciation is never quite complete. There is always a subtle sense that something is still owed, even when nothing was explicitly asked for. And that shifts the emotional balance of the relationship. Love starts to feel conditional without anyone directly stating conditions. You begin to feel like you are constantly being evaluated against a standard you were never clearly shown. Over time, this builds a persistent sense of guilt in the other person, as if love has to be continuously repaid rather than freely shared. And then there's projection, the part that often hits the deepest. This is when the very behaviors they struggle with are reflected back at you as accusations. You're too sensitive. You're manipulative. You make everything about yourself. You hold grudges. Statements like these can be especially destabilizing because they often land on someone who is actually self-reflective, someone who questions themselves, someone who tries to take responsibility. And that's exactly why it works so effectively. It creates a kind of internal confusion where you start auditing your own reactions constantly. You begin asking whether you are destvidlna the problem, whether your responses are too emotional, whether your interpretation is unfair. Even when your original perception was accurate, repeated invalidation can slowly erode your trust in it. And once that trust weakens, it becomes harder to stand firm in your own experience, even when something feels clearly off. At this point, the dynamic is no longer just about individual behaviors. It becomes a feedback loop. One person withdraws or implies, the other overfunctions to restore connection. One person reframes, the other self-doubts. One person escalates subtly, the other tries harder to stabilize things. And with each cycle, the imbalance deepens, not because of a single action, but because of repetition without resolution. What makes this so difficult to recognize in real time is that it rarely feels extreme enough to justify concern. There are no constant explosions, no obvious hostility, no clear breaking point. Instead, there is a gradual reshaping of what feels normal. You begin to accept less clarity, more emotional guessing, and greater responsibility for managing someone else's unspoken states. And in that slow adjustment, the most significant shift happens almost invisibly. You stop expecting directness. You stop expecting emotional transparency. You stop expecting that your experience will be met with equal clarity. Instead, you adapt to interpretation, reading, guessing, and self-correcting as the primary way of maintaining connection. By the time that adaptation feels normal, the original balance of the relationship has already changed. You start turning inward. You question yourself. You replay conversations, trying to figure out whether maybe they were right about you all along. And while you're doing that, something subtle has already happened. The center of gravity in the relationship has shifted. The attention is no longer on what they said or did. It's now on your reaction to it, your tone, your memory, your interpretation. That shift is part of what makes these dynamics so disorienting. Research and clinical discussion around narcissistic personality patterns often distinguish between more overt, grandiose presentations and what is sometimes described as vulnerable or covert expression. In these discussions, the outward behavior can appear less obviously dominating and more sensitive, withdrawn, or misunderstood. But underneath that presentation, the relational pattern can still involve control through emotional ambiguity, shifting narratives, and indirect pressure rather than direct confrontation. What's important to understand is not the label itself, but the structure of the interaction. Because in these patterns, control is rarely maintained through clear authority. It is maintained through confusion, reinterpretation, and emotional instability that gradually makes the other person doubt their own internal reference points. Over time, you stop trusting what you felt in the moment and start relying on how the other person frames your experience afterward. But understanding that doesn't make it your responsibility to repair it. What it does is bring clarity, because the most difficult part of recovering from this kind of relational dynamic isn't anger. It's the confusion it leaves behind. The overt, grandiose type of relational harm often leaves obvious rupture points, clear conflicts, direct insults, visible breakdowns. But the more covert pattern tends to dissolve those edges. Nothing feels fully resolved, but nothing feels fully provable either. You're left in a middle space where your emotional experience feels real, but hard to validate externally. And that creates a very specific kind of psychological residue. You begin to second guess not just what happened, but your ability to interpret what happens at all. You may notice yourself over-explaining, over-apologizing, or carefully constructing your words just to avoid being misunderstood again. Even in new environments or healthier relationships, that pattern can linger, as if your internal system is still trying to prevent a repeat of something it never fully got to define. And that's where the lasting impact happens. Not because you were the problem, but because the dynamic trained your attention inward in a way that became self-monitoring rather than self-trusting. Now, from a psychological perspective, one of the most important things to recognize is how predictable these cycles actually are once you step outside of them. They often follow a pattern of tension, withdrawal, or emotional shift, confusion in the other person, attempts to repair or overfunction, and then temporary reconnection. But the underlying issue is never fully addressed in a direct, grounded way. So the cycle resets. Each repetition reinforces the same lesson. Clarity does not lead to resolution, but adaptation does. So you adapt. You become more careful, more emotionally fluent in their cues, more sensitive to tone, timing, and subtext than to explicit communication. You begin to read silence as information. You treat distance as data. You try to anticipate shifts before they happen, not because you want control, but because unpredictability starts to feel unsafe. This is where the nervous system becomes deeply involved. It doesn't distinguish between emotional unpredictability and threat in the abstract sense. It responds to inconsistency in connection as something that requires management. Over time, this creates a state where peace is no longer experienced as default. It is experienced as something conditional, something that must be maintained through behavior. And in that state, even love starts to feel like a task. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation before speaking. Sometimes as rehearsing sentences in your head. Sometimes as reading a message multiple times before responding. Not because of the content itself, but because of what might be inferred from it. The internal question slowly shifts from "what do I feel" to "how will this be received?" That is one of the quietest signs of imbalance in relational dynamics. Because in a grounded connection, expression tends to move outward naturally. In a destabilized one, expression becomes filtered through prediction. And prediction, over time, replaces presence. Now, here's where clarity becomes important again. When these patterns are understood only emotionally, they can lead to resentment or fixation. But when they are understood structurally, something else becomes possible: distance from the automatic internalization of blame. You start to see that what felt personal was often systemic within the interaction pattern itself. This doesn't erase accountability on either side where it genuinely exists, but it does separate responsibility from absorption. You can acknowledge that something affected you without concluding that you are inherently flawed for being affected by it. That distinction is critical for recovery. Because without it, people often carry relationships long after they have ended, not in behavior, but in interpretation. They continue to rehearse explanations for things that were never clearly defined in the first place. And slowly, something begins to return. Your internal reference point. You start noticing moments where your initial perception was accurate, even if it was later questioned. You begin to recognize when your body responded to something before your mind could explain it. You become more willing to sit with your own interpretation without immediately outsourcing it for correction. That is not rigidity. That is recalibration. It is the process of rebuilding trust in your own perception after it has been repeatedly redirected. And over time, something shifts again. The need to constantly resolve the past starts to loosen, not because everything is perfectly understood, but because you stop believing that understanding someone else's internal world is required to validate your own experience. You don't need perfect clarity about their intentions to acknowledge the impact on you. And that realization changes the emotional structure of everything that came before it. What once felt like confusion begins to reorganize itself into pattern recognition. What once felt like self-blame begins to reveal relational dynamics. And what once felt like personal failure begins to look more like adaptation under emotional inconsistency. This is often where people ask themselves a deeper question. If I had seen this sooner, would I have acted differently? And the honest answer is usually not simple, because most of these dynamics are not obvious at the beginning. They unfold gradually through small shifts that are easy to explain individually, but harder to see as a whole. It is only in hindsight that the structure becomes visible. So the goal is not self-recrimination for not seeing it earlier. The goal is integration of what you now see more clearly. Because insight is only useful when it changes how you relate to yourself moving forward, not when it becomes another way to judge your past self. And if there is one thing that consistently emerges after people move through these dynamics, it is this. The clarity doesn't just change how you see them, it changes how you return to yourself. In the end, what makes this kind of experience so difficult to understand is not what is said or done openly, but what slowly gets inside your perception of yourself. There are no obvious scenes, no clear moments where everything suddenly breaks. Instead, it is a gradual shift. You begin to second-guess your tone, your intentions, your memory of events. You start editing yourself before you even speak. You become more careful, more accommodating, more focused on keeping the peace than on understanding your own emotional reality. And over time, that creates a quiet form of disconnection from the relationship, but also from your own internal clarity. The most important truth to recognize is that confusion is not proof of your fault. Emotional disorientation is often the result of inconsistent signals, shifting narratives and dynamics that keep responsibility unclear. When you are constantly pushed to question your reactions instead of the pattern itself, it becomes very easy to turn inward in a way that is unfair to yourself. But clarity begins the moment you step back far enough to see the pattern as a pattern, not as isolated moments. You start to understand that your inability to explain what was happening in real time did not mean nothing was happening. It only meant the experience was subtle, layered, and psychologically complex. And once you see that, something important changes. The blame that kept circling back onto you starts to lose its weight. You begin to separate what was yours to own from what was never yours to carry in the first place. You realize that empathy does not require self-erasure, and reflection does not mean accepting every accusation as truth. Healing, in this sense, is not about rewriting the past. It is about reclaiming your interpretation of it. It is about trusting that your discomfort had meaning, even when it was hard to articulate. And it is about allowing yourself to stop living in a constant state of internal defense, because the goal was never to become perfect in someone else's eyes. The goal is to return to a place where your thoughts, your feelings, and your experiences feel coherent again, where you no longer need to debate your own reality just to feel grounded in it. And from that place, clarity becomes something steady, not something you have to fight for.